To our Rethinking Iran, the first event that we are having this semester at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. My name is Nargis Bajoli. I'm an assistant professor here at the Middle East Studies program at SAIS. And this is our third semester of the Rethinking Iran initiative that we began in the spring of 2019 at SAIS, with the goal of expanding and furthering the conversation on Iran in Washington, D.C. and beyond. We're very excited for our lineup of events for this semester, which we will be having to do in the virtual format due to COVID, but it allows us to bring more speakers and it allows us to reach further audiences. So we do hope that you'll be joining us. You can find out more about our programming online on rethinkingiran.com, as well as our social media handles are all at Rethinking Iran. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for this semester, including our distinguished speaker for today. We'll also be talking with Aryan Tabatabai in the coming weeks, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, and also book talks with Philip Gordon, Arzu Osanlu, and Manata Hashemi, as well as some other speakers that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks, so do keep tuned. So in our third semester of doing these events, we are looking specifically this semester with the lead up to the American presidential elections in a little bit over a month at the critical juncture of Iran-US relations. We'll also be continuing that theme in the spring semester, given the Iranian elections, presidential elections that will be coming up in the spring. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce to you all our speaker for today, Ilan Goldenberg, who is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security. He's a foreign policy and defense expert with extensive government experience covering Iran's nuclear deal, the Iranian-Palestinian conflict, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the broader challenges facing the Middle East. He'll be in conversation with my colleague, Professor Vadi Nast, who is the Majid Khadouri Professor of Middle East Studies here at SAIS and in International Relations at Johns Hopkins University. And he's spearheaded the Rethinking Iran series at SAIS, and he's the author of numerous books, among them Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy and Retreat, Forces of Fortune, The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class, and the Shia Revival. So I will turn it over first to Ilan Goldenberg, and from there to my colleague, Vadi Nast.
So thank you for having me, and Vali, great to see you, and Nargis, and for this discussion. I thought what I'd do is maybe spend a few minutes at the top talking about a report we recently put out at CNAS about a month ago. This was, the sort of result of a series of consultations we did with American policymakers and experts, as well as consultations with a whole series of international representatives, whether it's Iranians, Israelis, Saudis, Europeans, Russians, and others, to get their perspectives. And really what the report looks at is, what could US re-engagement with Iran look like in 2021? Whether in a Biden administration or a Trump administration that decided it wanted to negotiate with Iran. And so I'll lay out a bit of a pathway, starting with, I guess, some of the key lessons from the last few years. And so I would say that the key lessons, both from the JCPOA and from the American withdrawal from the JCPOA, start with the fact that a nuclear deal is doable, right? I mean, I think this is what we know from the JCPOA. This was incredibly hard to negotiate in 2015. Any kind of re-engagement would be hard to negotiate again, but probably significantly easier, just because at least the parameters of what an agreement could look like are already quite well known, even if the level of trust might be even worse than it was in 2015 or 2013 to 15 when the JCPOA was negotiated. Other things to keep in mind, there's going to be, if a new American administration comes in early 2021, there's going to be a very narrow, limited period of time, at least to get something done, because Iran has its own political calendar and presidential elections in June of 2020. Now, we all know that ultimately, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, is the decision maker on key issues, right? So a serious US-Iran diplomacy would need to involve support from him. So maybe in some ways you could say, well, it doesn't matter who the president is. But on the other hand, having Hassan Rouhani and Javad Zarif and others in place will mean that they will influence a debate and they will influence the supreme leader's thinking. They have an interest in trying to come back to some kind of an agreement. And especially if it's a Biden administration, you'll also have personal relationships, which matter a lot too in these types of negotiations. And having people who have worked together before on the American and Iranian side would make a difference. And so you have this narrow window to try to do something. But realistically, during that narrow window, you're not going to cut some huge new deal that addresses all the outstanding issues between Iran and the United States, both because of the politics in Iran and the reality that something that complicated would take a long time. And the Biden administration would want to staff up seriously before it did that, and that also takes time. Other key lessons I think that we've learned from the previous experience. A nuclear deal is possible, but a nuclear-only deal is less likely to be sustainable if there's nothing sort of on the region that accompanies it. Because you have a lot of anxiety and concern from a number of American partners, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE being the most noteworthy, as well as concern and objections from Republican members of Congress and some Democrats. And so if you just focus on the nuclear issue and you do nothing in the regional space, those concerns are all going to come back. Those concerns generate the type of opposition that created a situation where President Trump left the deal in the first place. So you need to do something to address those concerns. At the same time, the answer, in my view, is not, okay, let's just negotiate on everything all at once and do a big grand bargain that addresses all of the concerns, because that historically hasn't worked. You have too many complicated issues going at once. If you feel like you need to get Iran to give up its support for Hezbollah in order to be able to cut an arms control deal, like that's never going to happen. In fact, that's what Mike Pompeo has kind of been trying to do for the past couple of years with his 12 points. It's really been, let's deal with everything all at once. So you need a strategy that recognizes you need to deal with all these different issues, but also doesn't wrap them all up in each other. So those are sort of the key lessons and constraints that you're dealing with, right? A limited time period to get something done, a nuclear deal that is totally doable, but complicated, regional issues that are incredibly complex and will take a lot longer that also need to be at least partially addressed, or you need to begin addressing them. And so you put those conditions in place, what I would recommend then, and what my colleagues, together with my colleagues, Kayleigh Thomas and Alyssa Catalano-Yours, who were my co-writers on this report, is kind of a phased strategy for a different administration. And by the way, again, a Trump administration could do this too, and President Trump himself has expressed an interest in going back into negotiations with Iran. So it could also be that if Trump wins, Iran will decide we don't want 4 more years of maximum pressure and re-engages in negotiations with Trump. Right now, I think the Iranians are choosing not to do that. And either just to wait and see where the elections go, and also because they're so deeply frustrated with how the Trump administration has treated them. And so what would the approach like that look like? I think you'd have to go in phases. And phase 1 would be what we call de-escalation. De-escalation is something that you should start on January 20th if you're Joe Biden, or November 4th if you're Donald Trump and you win re-election. And I would argue it should include a few things. One, I would make a case for some unilateral, immediate American steps. The most significant being, ending the Muslim ban on day 1, the immigration ban, as well as steps, especially humanitarian sanctions relief associated with COVID-19, medicine, things like that. At a minimum, you'd want to do that. You might also want to take off some of the sanctions on the people you want to negotiate with, like Javad Zarif, who's now been sanctioned, at least as a first step. Then I think what you'd look to do is some kind of a nuclear agreement that basically contains Iran's nuclear program, or at least stops and freezes its production in exchange for sanctions relief. And that could go one of 2 ways. It could be, as Vice President Biden has committed to, that the US says we want to go back into the nuclear agreement. Iran says, okay, we do too. You negotiate the details of what that looks like. And both sides mutually return to the JCPOA. The benefits of that are, it's probably the cleanest, simplest thing you can do. You don't have to reopen very complex new negotiations. There's no congressional approval necessary. And it actually probably gets you the most nuclear steps for the most sanctions relief. But it's possible that that won't work. It's also possible that if you do this, you're going to alienate, the constituencies that oppose the JCPOA from the start, in some ways permanently. Israel, Saudi, and Republicans. and won't really have a pathway in terms of a longer term negotiation that tries to bring those characters in and those actors in. An alternative is to do something smaller, like the JPOA, the agreement from 2013, or a proposal that was put forward by President Macron in 2019. There's all different kinds of models for this, but it would basically be Iran freezes its nuclear program, goes back to some of the commitments that were in the JCPOA, but doesn't go all the way back for some partial sanctions relief. The benefits of this would be if renegotiating or going back into the JCPOA becomes too complicated, this could be a good backup option. It could be actually simpler and cleaner in that scenario. It could, you could take away some of the political taint associated with the JCPOA, which might sort of provide reassurance, again, for those who oppose the agreement, and more space for future negotiations. But, it doesn't get you as much on the nuclear file. And it also, by the way, would likely trigger a new congressional review process because of the way of basically the INARA, the Iran Nuclear Review Act of 2015, that would sort of force approval of any new arrangement with Iran. Congress could not block the president in that scenario. You need 67 votes to block, which you won't have no matter what happens in Congress, but it just creates another headache and another sort of complication early in this process. And so those are kind of the pros and cons. I mean, where I recommend, if it's President Trump, I think going back to the JCPOA is not an option. So this more limited option is the one to pursue. If it's Vice President Biden, at least my recommendation would be flexible, test both with the Iranians, probably given the very public commitment Vice President Biden has made to return to the JCPOA. You'd probably start by offering that, but be open to both options and test them. The key would be try to get something between January and June that de-escalates tension, so that we don't end up in a situation with a hardline government in Iran in August, no progress, and a more unstable situation. Importantly, I should say one other component that should be part of this initial agreement is some kind of agreement on calm for calm and de-escalation. This doesn't need to be super detailed. Once you start negotiating, find, all kinds of details of regional arrangements, I think it collapses. But basically, if it's pretty clear that we're going back to where we were before May of 2019, when, attacks started on shipping in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, when you had missile attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, attacks on Americans in Iraq, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, if we can sort of go back to a moment before all that, and how we restrain ourselves and de-escalate, that would be constructive. And both sides can sort of, I think, do that with one sentence in a private agreement, right? That just kind of says we're all going to de-escalate. So that would be how I would at least see the first phase. And then what I would argue after that is, once you have a new team fully in place, once Iran's had its own elections, once you've bought this time, then go into what a more serious long-term dialogue could look like. And for that approach, what we recommend is two pieces: parallel tracks on the nuclear issue and the regional issue. Let me talk first about the regional issue, because that's the one that sometimes gets short shrift, but I think in this case it's more important. On the regional issue, what you would look to do is try to see if you can put the right players in the room. So that is the P5, at least that's Iran and Saudi Arabia for starters. Iran's is happy to have a negotiation just in the region, the regional players, but the Gulf states are going to want the US in the room for that negotiation. I'm not sure Iran is going to want the US in the room by itself. And so the Iran structure that might make the most sense is P5+1 plus Iran plus the Gulf states to start this dialogue. Create a big umbrella for a negotiation. When the reality is, most of the negotiations would be more bilateral or smaller. You're not going to put 20 countries in a room and have a serious dialogue, but you create the umbrella for that kind of dialogue. Importantly, what this is not is some idea to transform the region. I think what you want to do is be very pragmatic in your approach by just start looking for de-escalatory deals and issues that the countries can talk about. And so some of the issues that might be early on in the agenda, I would argue for maybe an agreement by all sides to not interfere in each other's internal affairs. So Iran, for example, supports various groups in Eastern Saudi Arabia. It doesn't get a lot for that, but it absolutely freaks out the Saudis by doing it. The Saudis support groups such as the MEK sometimes. Again, the MEK is not going to overthrow the leadership in Tehran, but it sure infuriates Iran's leadership when Saudi does that. So maybe we can all take steps to de-escalate there. Naval communications between the two sides to avoid escalation. Cooperation on transnational issues like COVID or the environment. I would even argue some of the issues we've talked about as being most sensitive, like nuclear, could actually have a regional component to them in terms of types of inspections and regimes that everybody in the region is willing to adhere to. Or missiles, which Americans have tried to, Europeans have tried to bring up in dialogue with Iran and has been met with like, no, we're not going to do that in the nuclear context. That has a lot to do with the fact that Iran's missile program is seen by Iran as kind of a key regional security issue. But in the context of regional conventional arms control, there might be more openness to do that. So, I would argue for a major initiative to try and push these ideas forward. And I do think there's space to do this now. Largely because I think in the aftermath of the tensions of the past year in the region, I think the Gulf states were pretty frustrated at the end with President Obama. They didn't like what he did. They didn't like the nuclear deal. But they've also gotten pretty nervous with President Trump's escalatory approach when it started leading to almost conflict. You have seen these noises from both sides about a willingness to talk. So we should try to take advantage of that instead of standing in the way of it. Now, if you make progress there, you can always go back and have additional dialogue on the nuclear issue. And there are still concerns there, especially about the sunset provisions in the JCPOA that starts to expire after a number of years. I think we still have time there. If we make progress on the regional track, it'll be easier to have that negotiation. And we should be clear, we're not just going to be demanding longer extensions on sunsets for nothing. We need to be able to give Iran more for that. And that more would be more sanctions relief, including, I would argue, for starting to remove some of the direct American embargo and start to get American companies directly interested in doing business with Iran. And so, in my mind, I think you don't want these two tracks to be totally intermingled, because at the end of the day, we need the nuclear issue still the most important for the US. And we don't want all these other very complicated issues out there sort of making it impossible to do a nuclear deal. But if you make progress on those other issues, you will have less opposition to a new nuclear agreement, and you'll have more space. So it can be clear to the Iranians that the level of sanctions relief the United States will be willing to provide in, a nuclear agreement will at least be partially dependent on how things are going in the regional tract, right? So progress here will make progress here easier, but they're not entirely contingent on each other. So anyway, there's a lot more to dive into why this is the way it is and what we can do, but maybe I'll just stop there, Avali, and hand it to you.
So thank you very much, Ilan, first of all, for joining us. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Rethinking Iran series and to SAIS. And I have to say, I read your report at SAIS when it came out. I think it's perhaps the most comprehensive and innovative piece that I've seen on this very complicated issues. And just as you alluded to in the report, also you flush out the various dimensions that we have to tackle, that this is much more than I'll have a deal with Iran within a week, which President Trump throws out there. And I recommend to everyone to take a look at the SAIS report, at least as a beginning of the conversation. So let me, you obviously touched on a lot of issues, and I think it's very helpful the way you've done it, because it does deal with the complexities of JCPOA, but it also touches on the other issues like missiles and regional issues, but in a way that goes beyond this kind of critique of, and I think there's an unfair critique of JCPOA from day one, that it should have solved everything with Iran in one go. It wasn't possible then, and it's not going to be possible in the future. But let me start by a couple of things that I want to hear your reaction to it. One is that, as we're getting closer to the election, there's now increasingly at least a set of opinions in the policymaking environment, in the public area, that is pushing that the US should not actually rush, and we should not be driven by any kind of a timeline or a calendar, whether it's an American one or an Iranian one, and we should just wait. So I just want to get your reaction to that. I mean, you probed that, but what are the disadvantages, let's say, for us to just let Iran sit on their sanctions until June and not engage, let's say, on January 20th?
Sure. And to be honest, Vali, like about a year and a half ago, I was in the camp of, let's just wait and renegotiate because we have all the leverage. And then I started doing the practical work on it, including a simulation exercise that we did at CNAS about a year ago on sort of what a negotiation would look like, and very quickly concluded that is way too complicated and way too risky. So the arguments for waiting are we have all the leverage. So the response is, well, we kind of have the leverage anyway. I think one thing the Trump administration has demonstrated is we can take sanctions on and we can take sanctions off unilaterally. And I was one making the argument that these will be a lot weaker because they won't be multilateral. Well, actually, it turns out we can do that, and we do have that leverage. So that should give us the flexibility to be able to take them off because we know we can put them back on. And frankly, the approach thus far, where these sanctions have failed, is because of the international unity or lack thereof. We haven't actually been able to change Iranian behavior. So you can smash their economy, but you can't change their behavior, which is really the objective. And so the other thing I would say on this is, like I said, Khamenei is the ultimate decision maker, and we need to be clear about that. But having Rouhani for a few months matters because this is about professionalism. It's about personal relationships and getting in the room and starting to get to know people when you deal with them. And a team Biden and a team, with Rouhani and Zarif will be able to do that very quickly, which means you can get to something. And something is better than nothing. And the reason I'll say that is I'll point you to, what we had last January. I mean, it boggles the mind only 9 months ago, the killing of Qasem Soleimani and a near war. Like this dominated the news. Seems like 20 years ago, given everything the world has been through since. But precisely because of that, there's a benefit to early de-escalation. And sorry if you're hearing my dog in the background. It must be UPS truck or something. But yeah, so I think precisely because of that, the risk of war is so great, or great enough. I don't want to go out over the line and say hair on fire, we're about to go to war if we don't get a deal, but an opportunity to significantly reduce that risk. And frankly, at a time where the US has, in terms of our national interest, other things that are more important: economic recovery, COVID, China. We need this Iran problem in a box and then a plan for a long-term approach to it, as opposed to continuing to have it out there as a huge risk.
Right. No, actually, that's a very good way of putting it. I mean, I think that the Iranians also look at the current situation in the U.S. and are focused on China, and they calculate accordingly. So, recently, both Iran's foreign minister had a talk at Council on Foreign Relations, and then separately, I think their ambassador at the UN sort of raised this issue that, first of all, Iran, even to go back to full compliance or to move back into compliance within JCPOA, that they want more than US compliance. They want compensation for what they say, quote unquote, as illegal US departure from the deal. And also they want some kinds of guarantees that they don't come back in, and let's say down the road, the US again decides that it's going to reimpose the sanctions. I wonder what do you think about that is, and how much of an obstacle it is, or is there ways for the United States to sort of provide some kind of a sort of political cover for Iran to come back into the deal?
Yeah, so the compensation issue is, I sort of see that there's just these three issues that sort of stand in the way of an easy return. One is compensation. Two is how you interpret all the sanctions that have come back since 2018. Many of those are, direct violations of the JCPOA that are easy to unwind, but some of them are really targeted at the IRGC, which were fair game in the JCPOA. And so how the US interprets those, I think, will matter. And then also this American sort of insistence on let's also talk about other issues in the future. I think all of them are solvable. The compensation one, I have a hard time seeing the United States offering direct compensation itself or saying it, but I can see some of America's P5+1 allies offering it. I can see, the approach the US takes towards, for example, what OFAC says and does and the kind of public signaling that comes before the deal itself, which actually is going to matter a great deal for what companies are willing to do and invest. In a world, there's been this, for example, Instex mechanisms that's been set up by Europe, but almost nothing has flown through it because the interpretation of the Trump administration will just sanction anything that goes through it. If the signaling was different on that, could you start to see early movement? So I think there's things that can be done as long as if Iran can say we got compensation and any American administration can say, no, you didn't get compensation. We just went back into the deal. The issues can be fudged. The other two, just to touch on, I think the agreement on, I think Iran will just need to understand that any American president who goes back into the deal is going to say, we're going to negotiate on all these other things. And Iran doesn't need to publicly commit to any of that. But I think if things go well on JCPOA return, we'll find a way to do that. And then the question of, your question about guarantees is a critical one. It might be the hardest one to that's more of a calculation for Iran to make. Is it worth it to do this and go back in, even with that risk, and see if an American president can build more bipartisan support over time? I'm kind of skeptical. I'm not sure we get there, and that's just a risk Iran might have to bake into any decision it makes.
That's a very interesting point. And I think, you raise an interesting issue, which is perhaps Iran will gauge, how risky this is by how much the new president is willing to actually take on Congress. I think the lesson learned after JCPOA was that the Obama administration had a low threshold for really entangling and getting into sort of brass knuckles push and pull with Congress. So I think that's a big indication. But you're right, it remains to be seen. They have to decide, because I don't think guarantees are really, there's no guarantees that the US can give that you could actually say will stick. The other issue I think you raised, and it's very interesting, is about IRGC. And I know it's a very sticky issue in the US, and my colleague Narges, who's an expert on IRGC, can correct me, but one of the tragedies of Trump maximum pressure, it has empowered them a lot more in Iran, and it's very difficult to see that the supreme leader has the same kind of freedom of movement of unilateral decision now without bringing IRGC fully on board, especially after Soleimani's killing, than he had in 2015, and that might particularly because they were designated and they're much more under fire. It raises interesting issues for the US about how it navigates a sort of a change of landscape in Iran. I wanted to, you mentioned something else which I think was very important about the way in which we bring the region on board, and I want to probe that a little bit more. The way, I think partly when 2015 happened, there were sort of layers of unhappiness in the region. At some level, they were worried about Iran getting a free hand to be even more aggressive in the region. There were those who just worried about the United States and Iran getting closer together. And I think, now with this overhang of this conversation across the board in the US, that we're going to be withdrawing from the region at any rate. And now our economy, the realities of global politics requires us to focus elsewhere in the world. And anytime US and Iran sit together, it automatically means that United States and Iran have to take steps towards one another. So we come out of this current near war situation. What can the United States do differently in terms of giving confidence or managing the anxieties of at least Iran's Arab neighbors, so that they don't react the way they did last time? I mean, I'm reminded of of the Camp David meetings that happened last time and didn't go well. Let's say if those Camp David meetings were going to happen under President Biden, how would that be different? What should we give the region to basically buy their support?
Sure. So I think there's a few things that you can do. One, I think the region is looking a little more pragmatically at some of these things in the aftermath of the escalation last year. So certainly the Emiratis, the Saudis are a little bit more of an open question. But, I mean, there's been noise of them wanting to talk to each other, and the American position has been, no, that would weaken maximum pressure. Like, we have stood in the way. In my mind, that is insane. So one is, like, give them a green light to start engaging with each other. Two is come to them early with something realistic. Come to them and say, look, it's in our interest to negotiate with Iran. We care about the nuclear issue, but we're going to care more about the regional issue or pay more attention to it than we have in the past. So one is, as part of even going back to the JCPOA, we're going to do a deal on at least calm for calm in the region, right? So from the beginning, you're signaling it's both the region and the nuclear issue. And then what you also want to signal is one of the biggest regional concerns has been all the sanctions relief comes up front and it's all based on the nuclear issue. And by sort of saying we're going to have these two separate tracks and we're going to need progress on the region before we do significant more sanctions relief, you're kind of offering some reassurance to the region as well. And then I think part of it is also two other things, coming to them with, like, this is not about supporting the moderates and transforming Iran and transforming the Middle East. I think that kind of language actually just scares the region. They're just like terrified of it. Because they think we're just naive, stupid Americans, right? Why are you doing this? But if you come and say, like, we're looking for pragmatic, de-escalatory, small steps so we can all avoid a war we don't want and we can all improve things slowly over time, like that I think will be a message that resounds more positively. And then maybe I'll just say this. Look, I think part of the challenge the Gulf states had with President Obama was they kind of knew he didn't have the patience for them. Like, for them, these are small monarchies, like personality and like personal relationships matter like a great deal more than like how many arms, like how many weapons you sell them. And they kind of knew, like, I'm a huge supporter of President Obama's, like, and I worked in his administration. But I think on this issue, like, the Obama, they didn't click, right? I mean, Obama just did not have the patience for, a bunch of these relatively older, like, authoritarian, like, you saw it in that Jeffrey Goldberg interview, and that mattered like a lot more than like anything you could give them. And Biden's style, like a creature of the Senate who spent 30 years in the Senate and knows these guys, I think, better, like, might have more patience for reassuring, for listening, for actually engaging with them, which could also, I think, make things a little bit easier. So it's a combination of, not trying to buy them off, but instead trying to have a real conversation with them, trying to listen to their perspectives, but also the reality that they're in a different place could all help. And then maybe just one other point, Vali, on this. I agree with you that the U.S., there is this noise for the U.S. to leave the Middle East. And I do support reducing our military footprint in the Middle East. But it doesn't mean walking away from diplomacy. I think in other regions of the world, Asia and Europe in particular, the other two key strategic regions, we lead with our diplomacy and our economy, and then the military is there in the background. It's only the Middle East where we lead with the military and economy and diplomacy are in the background. And so a rebalancing of the tools doesn't mean withdrawal. Hopefully we can convince our friends in the region that's the case, because,
Very, very interesting points. I actually, as you were talking, I was thinking that, whether that puts pressure on Congress and let's say a Democratic president to back away from some of the sort of policy adjustments on, let's say, Saudi Arabia that's being discussed in light of the Khashoggi affair or the war in Yemen, and whether the U.S. has to sort of factor those things in as well. But you opened the door to sort of the other big news in the Middle East, which has been, other than Iran, that has captured headlines, and that is the UAE Israel deal, UAE Bahrain Israel deal. And I know that a lot of the coverage in the United States focused on the Palestinian issue and what it means for them, which obviously is one important vector of the conversation. But it's very clear that, you know, the Israelis and UAE didn't do this because of the Palestinians. They actually tried to sidestep the obstacle that the Palestinian issue was, and this is largely about Iran. And so I wanted to see, how do you think this fits into the picture, and whether how would the United States either leverage or try to manage these alliances, and generally how would the next administration think about this new development, which is different from 2015?
Yeah. So look, I would say, first of all, the Israel UAE Bahrain deal, it's a good thing, right? Whenever you have countries that don't have diplomatic relations, opening diplomatic relations, especially in a region as turbulent as the Middle East has been for the past 20 years, it's a good thing to have more of this communication. You know, I think for them, it was mostly just increasing cooperation that had been happening for years on the security front, right? And which had a lot to do with their joint interest in countering Iran. I also think there's a large economic component to this, especially in a world where oil prices have really bottomed out, and you have COVID, and Israel is a sort of engine of technology, and it wants new markets, and the UAE is a very appealing market to Israel. So part of this is very much economic. And I will say, like, the Palestinian issue, it still played in all of this. Like the fact that Israel basically promised not to annex the West Bank for a number of years in exchange meant the issue still played, but you're right, it's not what it used to be, and it really wasn't the centerpiece of it. On Iran, on the one hand, I could see this raising anxiety in Tehran, sort of further unity of some of its competitors who have been less coordinated. But I mean, practically speaking, the coordination on security is already quite deep. So I'm not sure this adds a lot of new dimensions or threats to it. I do think it also creates some interesting opportunities. For example, precisely in a world where the UAE is engaging with Iran in some kind of a dialogue, which we've seen some of, to be able to have that link to Israel, like in our proposal on sort of a broader regional dialogue, we didn't really have Israel, like we thought it was just a jump too far to have Israel sitting at the table with Iran, at least early in those types of discussions, maybe years down the road. But, a structure where there's a contact group that can then engage with Israel and includes a number of the Arab states to make sure they're all kind of being integrated and interests are being raised is one option. And that's easier to do if Israel's got normalized relations with a number of these countries. So I think it sort of plays both ways. Very
good. So I think we wanted to leave some time at the end for question and answer. So I'm going to turn it over to Nargis to moderate that part of it.
Sure. So we have viewers who are both on our Zoom, on our YouTube, and the other platforms that we are streaming on. So we've been going through questions from all these different platforms. One of the attendees, Ilan, asked about how will the nascent nuclear programs of Iran's neighbors, notably Saudi Arabia and the UAE, influence Iran's negotiation position, especially since the Trump administration has granted 2 authorizations to US companies to share sensitive nuclear power information with Saudi Arabia. So thinking about negotiations with Iran vis-a-vis nuclear ambitions from the neighboring countries.
Well, look, I mean, I think with the UAE, the fact that the UAE has basically agreed to the gold standard, which means no domestic enrichment, is a consistent point of leverage in our negotiations, because it says if everybody in the region agrees to this, like, this is what we want. So the UAE has agreed to very tight restrictions, and in exchange for those restrictions has gotten huge economic benefits. I'd much rather have the UAE deal than the JCPOA. I mean, in terms of the economic benefits, you're talking about billions of dollars for a real functioning civilian nuclear program, as opposed to the JCPOA, which just gives Iran a very symbolic but not really meaningful program on the civilian side. Saudi is a more complicated question. And Saudi, we actually just did a research project at CNAS where we kind of looked at, the changing dynamics of geopolitics in the age of great power competition, and what it might mean for nuclear proliferation. And like all of the key indicators that we developed the indicators first, and then we tested them against a few different countries. And Saudi Arabia was by far the most worrisome, which kind of was an eye opener for me. The regional environment is that it's in is difficult precisely because of its intense competition with Iran. It's got a new, young, brash, authoritarian leader, which is always sometimes a key factor for a country that might pursue nuclear weapons. It is, not been able to actually come to a deal with the US on a new 123 agreement, which we've been trying to negotiate with them. And if they go to the Chinese instead or other internationals, I think that there'll be a lot less restrictions. So I think what would be most beneficial, actually, if you had a regional dialogue that involved Iran and Saudi and UAE and others, you're never going to get them, I don't think, to agree on like international enrichment, but you can potentially get them all to agree on maybe the same inspections regime. And maybe that inspections regime could look like the JCPOA. In other words, take the JCPOA inspections regime and apply it to all the countries in the region, which would make it easier for Iran to extend those limitations, because it wouldn't be, hey, Iran, you're being singled out, which is something that Iranian negotiators and leaders really hate about the JCPOA. But would also be reassuring to the other countries in the region that everybody is sort of, getting the same treatment. And so maybe there's something that can be done there, but it's one idea that we sort of tossed around that actually Ernie Muniz, the former Secretary of Energy and one of the sort of key negotiators that JCPOA has been proposing lately.
And there are a couple who have asked about human rights issues. How do those factor in, human rights issues on Iran? How do they factor into any possible negotiations looking forward between Iran and the US, or just in general, the human rights situation when it comes to thinking about the future relationships or any sort of dialogue between the countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be speaking out on human rights and finding ways to hold the Iranian leadership accountable. But I mean, at the end of the day, and this human rights has always been an issue that's mattered in the US-Iran relationship, but it's always been sort of secondary to sort of tougher issues of national interest having to do with nuclear weapons and regional conflict. And I think if you can address those, you both, I think at the end of the day, do a lot more good for a lot more people. So we should use the same tools that we use, on the human rights question that we do we shouldn't treat Iran differently, right? Like it's a human rights violator, it should be treated like other human rights violators. That includes some of our friends who we also give a hard time to and should give a hard time to. Like, so keep ourselves being open, we shouldn't be hypocrites about this. But we also sometimes need to honestly value the trade-off between engaging on certain things and sort of taking a hard line to the point where you can't do anything on issues of war and peace that need to be done.
Great. Another person is asking if the Biden foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran and the State Department team that he would potentially build, would it be different? How different would his foreign policy be than the Obama administration, and especially in regards to Iran, US, but in general?
So I don't know that because I don't know who he's going to pick or what that policy might be, and I wouldn't pretend to speak for them. But you can look at what he has said publicly, right, as the best. And what he has said is he wants to go back into the JCPOA. He wants to then negotiate on other issues, on missiles, on sunsets, on regional disagreements. He's also talked at length. They put out statements about very specific ideas for how to do COVID-19 related sanctions relief. He's talked about ending the Muslim ban. And so I think that would be your starting point for this discussion. Where it goes, I think then depends on where things go with Iran. But, I think that's kind of where we are.
Mm-hmm. And as a follow-up to that, there's another question coming in about folks like Netanyahu, folks who really see the military capabilities of Hezbollah and Iran as an existential threat to Israel, or as something that they must weaken and it cannot exist in the capacity that it does today? How does that bear on any form of either a deal or any form of a normalization or a calm for calm that you were speaking about before with Badi?
So look, I think for the Israelis, there'll be a big question of the Israelis will not like going back into the JCPOA if that's what the US chooses to do. They'll certainly be happier with one of the alternatives. But they'll have a decision to make if the United States decides to go back in, which is, do you want to pick a very public fight with a new American president and do a repeat of 2015, which Netanyahu certainly might choose to do? Or does he want to try to work behind the scenes to do more to impact, American calculus, or, impact the policy, or get reassurances from the United States to address their concerns? I would hope they would choose, the latter. They might choose the former. And I do think that that the US should be pretty clear with the Israelis that we want to work with you. We want to cooperate with you. We want to take your issues into account. We can do this together. But if you go pick a public fight and start trying to undercut us in Congress, we're also happy to cut you out. So it's up to you. You want to be part of the solution, or do you want to be on the other side fighting it? You'll get more out of this if you're part of the solution. But again, that's very much up to Netanyahu, and his calculus will not only be based on national interest, but also on his domestic politics and very challenging situation he's facing right now there as well.
Yeah. On one of the last points that you and Vadi spoke about, you were speaking about the Israeli deals with the UAE and Bahrain, and some of the things that I've been reading about and looking at from the perspective of the IRGC, especially its relations with Syria and what's going on there, is that there's been, they are also quite close to the Israeli border, where in the Golan Heights. And so thinking through the relationship between Israel now being on Iran's borders potentially in the coming months, and Iran then trying to create deterrence potentially, or trying to say, hey, we can also sort of play at this game by coming on the Syria-Israeli border. Do you see, how do you see this sort of potential of it playing out in these relationships?
Sure. So first, I don't think Israel will be on Iran's border because it has a deal with the UAE. I don't think we're going to have Israeli military deploying to the UAE anytime in the near future. And I think if they were, then I think they'd find themselves kind of at a disadvantage in the same way that Iran is pushed into Syria and on Israel's border, but Israel has also conducted a pretty comprehensive military campaign against Iran's interest inside Syria. Dropped over, I think a few hundred operations, dropped over 1,000 bombs, destroyed a lot of Iranian weaponry and material. And part of the reason Iran hasn't really responded is because at the end of the day, it's a lot closer to Israel. Israel enjoys the geographic advantage, the strategic advantage in that area, in Syria. It's been, inside Syria or fighting with Syria since 1948. And so Iran is, I think, having a challenge of how much it can exert, all the way into the Israeli border and how much it can project force. I think Israel would face the same challenge. So each of them, this Israeli-Iranian competition sort of going on at sort of below the level, the threshold of all-out warfare has been going on for years. But there's different arenas which each has different advantages. And the closer you physically get to one country, the more that country has the advantage because of its knowledge and its interests. So I'm less worried about this at the end of the day, frankly.
Great. Thadi, did you want to come in? I saw you.
Well, no, I think it's since you broaden the aperture, I was wondering also, there's the other big player out here is also Turkey, and how do you see that playing out there in Syria, but also now we're seeing tensions in Azerbaijan, Armenia, where the Turks are very engaged. That's one. And secondly, compared to 2015, now we have a very different presence by Russia and China in the region, both, I guess, in terms of JCPOA, but also in terms of how the regional conversation could take place. Like, for instance, there's a lot of noise about Iran-China strategic partnership, as well as China's cooperation with Saudi Arabia over its nuclear program. And how would, let's say, a Biden administration connect those other pieces of its foreign policy to this much more narrower Iran policy?
So this is a good question that, again, I don't necessarily know the answer to, but in terms of how the Biden administration might do it, but just like my take would be, look, the Russians are a part of the region now in a way that they weren't a few years ago. They have been since the Syrian intervention. So like, time to just own up to that. And they have to be part of the, you're going to have serious, I think part of this regional dialogue eventually, I didn't really mention it, does need to involve like how you end the wars in Syria, Yemen, Libya. And Russia has a role there, especially in Syria and Yemen. And so needs to be acknowledged and needs to be part of that dialogue. And I think that they are pretty pragmatic and willing to cut pragmatic deals in their interests, though their overriding interest sometimes is just to sort of be seen as an equal power to the US or to undercut American leadership in places. The Chinese, my sense of them is they're still mostly in the economic sphere, but it's growing. I think I sort of joke that their attitude is like, we'll deal with the economics, America, you deal with the security, now stop screwing it up. While leaving us all the hard questions. And, maybe they should deal with more of the hard questions, and maybe we need to deal with less of the hard questions, because this isn't always a winner. I think that the increasing Iranian-Chinese ties are interesting, and almost like a natural partially rebound, as opposed to, after the US withdraw from the JCPOA. I also think there's limitations there. I mean, you both follow Iranian domestic politics more closely than I do, but lots of skepticism about Chinese products and the way they sort of hold sort of Iran hostage during times of sanctions to get the best, like really wring out the best deals they can. But I know a lot of debate inside the Iranian system on like, who should be our partner here? Should we be engaging the Europeans, the Chinese, or the Russians? So that'll, I think, continue to play out. And then on Turkey, I mean, kind of like the new wild card on the scene, right? That everybody needs to, for a long time, we've been thinking about this as Iran versus Saudi Arabia, or Iran versus Israel, or Iran versus Saudi versus Israel. But Turkey's kind of becoming its own little triangle of Turkey together with, you can almost, divide the region up into, you've got like Iran, and then you have like the Turkey, Qatar kind of thing going on, like that kind of relationship and axis. Then you've got the conservative Arab states, Saudi, Egypt, UAE. And Israel is kind of its own independent actor, but seems to be lining itself up mostly with the conservative Arab states. So the question for the US is like how you manage all these. I'm of the view you got to sort of try to negotiate in balance, as opposed to necessarily just hopping fully on board with one side. Though the Trump administration's approach is very much hop on board with Israel and hop on board with the conservative Arab states. They're still our most traditional, closest partners, and so we need to factor that into our calculus, which I agree with. It's just complicated how you manage it all.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Ilan, for joining us for this talk. We really appreciate it, and thank you for helping us kick off our Rethinking Iran series for the semester. To everyone who joined us on Zoom, on YouTube, on the various platforms we've been streaming on, we really appreciate it. There were over 80 folks on here, so we really appreciate all of that, for you all tuning in from everywhere. And again, please do check out rethinkingiran.com to see the rest of our programming for the semester, and we look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Thank you.